is Hari Han. I'm a professor of political science and also the director of the SNF Agora Institute. And I'm delighted to welcome you all today for our conversation, Election 2020 and its meaning for our democracy, a conversation for the Johns Hopkins community. Before we dive in, I want to start by thanking Willow Otten, who is providing original music for us today. Willow is a student at the Peabody Institute at Johns Hopkins, where she studies French horn, and she's also president of the Peabody Student Government Association. So we'll hear more from her throughout the day today. For today's event, the SNF Agora Institute is partnering with Hopkins at Home to invite the entire university community to join a conversation about what happened in last week's election and how we can move forward together towards realizing the promise of democracy. The weeks and months leading up to the election exposed just how divided we all are as a country. At SNF Agora, we're thinking about how we can begin to bridge those divides. We look to invite disparate voices into the kinds of conversations that allow us to discuss and to disagree in a way that still values each other's humanity and the fundamental right to hold each other's opposing viewpoints. And so today, we hope to model some of that kind of discussion. We're going to be live streaming 2 moderated panels that examine different implications of the election. After the webcast, we're going to invite all of you to join us in a Zoom meeting for a 30-minute session where we'll continue the conversation with question and answer with the speakers. If you haven't registered for that portion of the event, it's not too late. The registration link should be just below in the chat box on your screen. So I'm delighted to welcome our first panel. Our first panel is going to be asking the very broad question, how did we get here? And I'm pleased to welcome 3 great speakers to this panel. First, we have Steve Tellis, who is a professor of political science who studies the conservative movement, including with his most recent book, Never Trump, The Revolt of the Conservative Elites, which was published in May. We also have with us Veshla Weaver, who is a Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology. Her work looks at the persistence of racial inequality, colorism in the United States, the causes and consequences of the dramatic rise in prisons, and the consequences of rising economic polarization. And finally, we have Stephen Morgan, who is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Education, who will be moderating the discussion. Stephen's own research focuses on education, inequality, demography, and methodology. He's recently written about how Obama to Trump voters might vote in this year's election. So together, they're going to be looking at this current state of the election, why people voted the way they did, and what underlying racial, economic, party, or other dynamics might have led to the outcome, and I'm sure many other things. So please note that we won't be taking audience questions during the 25-minute discussion, but we invite you to join us for the Zoom conversation at 1 p.m., where the speakers will be available in smaller conversations with all of you. So I'm delighted to turn the conversation over to Steve Morgan.
Thank you, Hari. It's a real pleasure and an honor to get the ball rolling on this conversation. And our plan is simply to throw it to Veshla first and say, Veshla, how did we get here?
So thanks, Hari, and thanks everyone at the Agora Institute for having the idea to have this panel, so much needed. And thanks Steve and Steve for being my co-panelists. So I guess the resounding thought I had as we enter this, second week after or week after the election is that citizens observing the election and observing the context could be forgiven for being pulled in different directions by their news feeds, by election observers, by the polls. The 2020 moment is one, I think, of incongruity. It's utterly Janus-faced. What do I mean by that? So a couple things come to mind. Those who turned out and delivered votes literally are the places dying fastest and hit hardest by the pandemic. Deaths and joblessness. So as Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor said in the New Yorker just yesterday, tens of millions of Black voters once again will be praised for saving the party, by which she means the Democratic Party, even as they continue to die by the thousands. They will expect more than congratulations. And I want to come back to that later on when we talk about the role of Black voters in the Democratic Party as its most allegiant voting bloc. Second, we have a historic protest wave that created both an unprecedented swell of activism and brought more of the electorate out and socialized, young voters who were voting for the first time, but also a protest wave that likely delimited Biden's appeal to a shrinking white Democratic voter without a college education in rural areas. So that was the one area where the polls really got it wrong, really overestimated how much Biden would win or do better than in 2016 among the white electorate. Second or third, sharp declines we see in the faith of the American citizenry in our institutions. Questions over whether the guardrails of democracy will hold, and a leader who actively promoted the delegitimizing of the electoral system, even as, by all accounts, the electoral process worked, it wasn't undermined, and even as an unprecedented number cast ballots in unconventional ways through the mail. And even as that the kind of post-election violence mostly didn't happen. Next, the absence of a clear mandate amidst the highest turnout in a century, 160 million people turning out by most estimates. Biden must now, and I think Steve Tellis is going to talk a little bit about this, must govern a Democratic coalition that is comprised of, very different parts of that party, the kind of defund the police supporters to more moderate voters who bristle at transformative policy agendas. We have an election against the canvas of expressions of white supremacists, which are themselves abrading against the largest social movement in our history for Black freedom and Black life. I was reading the Marshall Project this morning, and a former white supremacist who had disavowed the group that he was part of said, never in our history have we had political leaders with the ear of the whole world mimic the things that we used to say when I was part of a hate group, right? When he was talking about the Proud Boys. Or how about the fact that Black voters delivered the edge for Biden, both in the nomination stage and in key battlegrounds and in key places like Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, and were critical to a Biden-Harris win. And here's the contradiction: those who suffered most from his 94 crime bill and affected by the actions of prosecutors like Kamala Harris. We had resounding support in this election for transformative criminal justice reform, whether it was the ousting of punitive prosecutors, to the election of Black sheriffs, to a wave of different reform proposals and ballot propositions from Portland to California. Marijuana is now decriminalized in 15 states, right? Even, and here comes the contradiction, the Janus-faced aspect, right? Even as we are now at the highest point of COVID deaths in prisons, and many are having new outbreaks, right? I could go on, but you see what I'm getting at, that this is a moment where part of the outcomes that we're seeing have to do with, I think, what Archon Fung calls high aperture, right? There's this moment where so many things are abrading, so many contradictions, and that's what's giving rise to some of this kind of Janus quality that we feel, right? An electoral process where that held up mostly, but where the very act of voting has now become politicized. The very act of voting in person has become politicized in new ways. So that's what I would start with, and what I hope we can dig into a bit later.
Thank you, Veshla. Steve Tellis, your turn.
Yeah, so I actually agree with a lot of what Veshla said, maybe actually more than I thought I would before Veshla started talking. And we should actually come back to the criminal justice issue, because that's something both of us have written about. And that I'm actually fairly optimistic about action occurring, but maybe in a different way than I think Veshla might be. So that'll be a thing that'll be interesting to play with, right? So One thing is we've gotten so used to polarization as the kind of water that we swim in the entire politics. And obviously political science, the discipline that both Veshla and I are in, has been dominated in some ways over the last few years by the discussion of where did polarization come from and what are its sources. That we are likely to be surprised when we see that some of the hydraulics of polarization may be changing, right? Political science always just sort of finally gets its head around something right at the moment when it's probably about to break down, right? And so the core of polarization are parties that are internally homogenous, especially in the legislature. And then in legislatures, thus transfer power to leaders who control the political agenda, right? When we're talking about polarization, that's usually what we mean, right? The parties are homogenous, they generally agree, and because they agree, they're willing to empower leaders to act on that agreement, right? And those leaders keep issues off the agenda that divide their party and trying to keep what's on the agenda to those issues where they can agree, right? That's what we mean when we talk about polarization, right? This works so long as legislators care more about the benefits they get from unity than the benefits they get from being able to put together coalitions with the other party, right? When that's true, that's when polarization works. And my argument is that this is precisely what is in the process of changing underneath the surface. Increasingly, actors on the outside of Congress and a few inside Congress are trying to change the agenda, trying to change what we're arguing about, what we think politics is about, what are the dominant issues that we're discussing, right? And injecting issues that have not been pre-aggregated by party, right? They're not the issues where the parties are entirely internally homogenous, right? So think about some of the issues that are the rising agenda issues, right? The regulation of tech monopolies, trade with China, industrial policy and national economic self-sufficiency, right? Which has become an issue in the aftermath of COVID, right? And criminal justice. All these issues are creeping higher and higher on the agenda of legislators. And the more these issues, which cut across the legacy partisan divide, go up the agenda, the more legislators are going to find that only being allowed to legislate with their own party is constricting, right? They're going to find themselves tied in by the fact that they want to legislate with the other party, right? Because they disagree with members of their own party, and they're going to want rules that allow them to engage in strange bedfellows coalitions, right? The kind of coalitions that were not so unusual in the 1970s and the 1980s, but have increasingly become less typical. At the same time, the parties are becoming more organizationally fractious. And you can see that in the fights that have already come out between Abby Spanberger and AOC, right? The Democratic Party, which until a few years ago was almost exclusively what Matt Grossman has called an interest group coalition, is being challenged on the left by an organized Justice Dem, DSA, Jacobin, whatever you want to call it, faction, and potentially in the right by a New Dem market liberal organized faction. The more the parties are organized into durably institutionalized systems of collective action inside the party, the harder it is going to be to get any of them to accept strong leadership control of the agenda, of congressional procedure, and anything else, right? That's also driven by the fact that these factions want, on particular issues, to legislate with the other party, right? So market liberals may want to legislate with the non-populist factions of the Republican Party, which are likely to form when Trump is out of office, right? Josh Hawley, very much in some ways on the party right, on the Republican Party, is going to want to be able to legislate with the Democratic Party left on things like tech concentration. And the more the parties are internally organized into these factions, the more they're going to be able to force their leaders to allow them to do so. Finally, we may see more play in the joints of the political system to the degree to which the parties believe that we're not in a condition of political trench warfare, in which all significant ethnic or racial or gender groups have picked a side, and the only question is who can turn out their base, right? That's a really important part of polarization, is the belief that the parties demographically have lined everybody up, and the only question is how much they can gin up their coalition. So I'm a non-believer that Trump actually got a significantly larger minority vote in whether African Americans. We know there's some of that among Cubans, Venezuelans, and South Florida. I don't think you have to use exit polls for that, right? But I do think the belief that Trump did actually do that, even if the empirical predicate of that is wrong, is consequential. It means that at least some parts of the Republican Party believe that there are Democratic votes out there to poach, just as Democrats have believed that there are, for example, suburban women to poach from the Republicans. And once that belief holds, right, even again, if it empirically is not true, that will start to change the behavior of at least pivotal parts of both political coalitions, such that we'll start to see a politics of entrepreneurial attempts by legislators to appeal to voters in the other coalition. So in some sense, that thing that was not true that caused people to change their behavior may in fact make it true later on, right? The final thing I'll say is there really are in fact divisions in each party coalition that can be exploited, right? Criminal justice is an interesting example of this, right? Because on the one hand, the African-American community is in some significant ways internally heterogeneous on some of these issues of policing and criminal justice, divided by secular versus more religious African Americans, Southern versus Northern, generationally. All these divides are actually quite consequential on criminal justice. And that is in important ways going to create some degree of flexibility in what kind of coalitions can be made on criminal justice issues. That is, I think there is a continuing coalition to be made by one part of social conservatives who in many cases have supported consequential criminal justice reform, and the 2/3, maybe most conservative part of the African-American community. That's been the really consequential coalition in lots of states that have done criminal justice reform. And I think that coalition is still there, right? That is in some degree of tension between the more mobilized Black Lives Matter part of the African-American community that I do think also has the potential for creating a backlash coalition against criminal justice reform, as well as in particular states, much more ambitious reform than the more moderate coalition is capable of. And that's where I think Veshla is right, that this is a moment in which there are an enormous number of possible outcomes, right? And that very small changes in strategy and other things can actually lead to very different sorts of outcomes under these conditions.
So you've both laid out a rich set of issues that could keep us going for hours, I'm sure. But I suppose we should just start with Veshla. Do you want to take Steve up on his invitation to counter his claim, his note of optimism on criminal justice reform?
No, not at all. I'm very optimistic. I think we saw on Tuesday, several bad sheriffs were ousted. We saw several sweeping reforms to, not all of them passed, but many of them did. So folks are, looking at California on Prop 25 and Prop 20, ending cash bail didn't work there. And so there was this immediate effort to say, well, see, there's a limit to how much. But actually, a lot of advocates, criminal justice progressives, were against that bill because it was about it didn't necessarily go far enough. And so, yeah, we've seen a ton of things, and I want to come back to that. But actually, I want to pick up on something Steve said, because I teach my students this notion of electoral capture. And what Steve, you were suggesting is that this isn't a critique, but I want to play with this a little bit. Just because you're a pivotal voter, right? Just because there's a lot of attention to, Cubans in Florida or Latinos in the Rio Grande Valley, doesn't mean that you're not a captured voter, right? So that was a big point of the notion of the concept of electoral capture. that you can be quite pivotal. You can deliver the margin of success for candidates' victories, and yet still, come governing time, not see changes that you favor on the policy agenda. And that's where Black voters have been for many elections. There's a great new book by Ishmael White and Cheryl Laird, Steadfast Democrats, that shows just how not only are Blacks one of the most uniformly allegiant groups to the Democratic Party, but their Democratic partisanship itself has become almost like a norm within the social identity, that to go against Democrats is basically to go against your racial group, right? It's become fused with a sense of cultural pride and identity. So I'm just curious, Steve, what you think. Steve, tell us what you think. You seem to be suggesting that the party is going to then, or both parties are going to try to mobilize these key pivotal voters and going to try to appeal to them and incorporate them in policy agendas. And I'm just not sure that the history shows that. They may be key at election time, but they're very much taken for granted. It will be interesting to see whether Biden, and I think he's in a very tough position, right? How he responds to the various segments of the electorate that delivered him and Harris a victory. Whether once he's in office, he's going to engage in the policy reforms that those groups most want.
Yeah, so I a while back published an article called "The Eternal Return of Compassionate Conservatism" that said that there is this recurrent theme in the Republican Party that the Republican Party ought to be appealing to African Americans. You go back to Nixon, it was Black capitalism, which was very much a term in the 1970s. Then it became empowerment, and then it was compassionate conservatism, and so there's a recurrent phenomenon here. Now, part of the reason that it comes up, right, is there are sort of internal party strategists who keep noticing that if the Democratic Party gets spotted the entire African American vote, then that puts the Republicans in a very difficult position, and just carving out a small percentage of the African American vote would make it very hard for Democrats to win in a large number of states. And so that then creates that as a tantalizing possibility that, on the one hand, it turns out lots of the core Republican interests actually have no interest in doing much about it other than speechifying. And that, for exactly the reasons that Veshel is mentioning, the degree to which race and partisanship are mixed together in important ways, even for voters who, in fact, on many issues, will tell you quite conservative answers to their attitudes, right? Even those voters have a high degree of party affiliation and identification of race and partisanship. And so the real question, I think, is going to be, can Republicans, who are now saying, well, this is a sign that the Republican Party needs to become a multiracial party of the working class. That's what Marco Rubio immediately came out and said, right? Is there, in fact, a set of voters whose partisanship can be separated, at least among African Americans, who can be separated, their partisanship from their racial identity? I think among Hispanics, that mixture of partisanship and race identity is not as strong, and therefore and also, they're constantly being refreshed by new voters coming into the political system in a way that African Americans are not. But again, I do think the belief that that's possible, even if we as social scientists can say that we're not so sure it is possible, can be consequential for agendas, including on things like criminal justice reform.
I think the other thing to add too is, I've been thinking a lot about, some of the things I teach in this moment. And, one of the biggest, you're right that Democratic Party allegiance is more situational, and Latinos were long called like the sleeping giant, right? Which way will they go? Which way will they swing? That kind of thing. but also policy threat. One of the biggest, yes, we're looking at election outcomes, but I want to see the numbers on how many Latino voters and Asian Americans got naturalized, how many registered. I'm thinking back to the Patriot Act, which was a key mobilizer to Arab Americans, to propositions in California that were key mobilizers and basically turned that state blue among Latinx electorates and Asian Americans, and not only drew them into the party, but also spurred huge increases in naturalizations. So you're not just bringing for one election cycle a group into the Democratic Party. You're literally bringing them into the electorate. I keep thinking about, I was listening to Matt Barreto the other day talking about how many thousand more Latino voters in Arizona and other places who were in high school in the last election, and how many more thousands were able to vote in this election, right? And were socialized in this moment of mishandling of the hurricane in Puerto Rico, of family separation at the border, of ICE continuing to do bad things to their communities, and thinking about that, coming on the original big protest wave around the Sensenbrenner bill in 2006.
Right. I guess the thing I would say on that is it is really important to remember that, we often, on campuses, we talk about Black and brown people, right? But they are not actually mirror images of one another, right? These groups are constituted in very different ways, right? The groups that we call Hispanics really are creatures of, of the census, right? They're creatures of a very weird process of the social construction of what is still not exactly a racial group. So I actually had a conversation with a Republican political strategist right after the election. I asked him, what was the lesson the Republicans are going to get out of this? And he said, the lesson is there are a lot of Hispanics who want to be white people, right? Who think of themselves as white, right? Actually can, and I said, well, you mean actually they can be mobilized on the basis of being working class? And he said, no. They think of themselves as white, and the Republican Party can actually appeal to them on that basis. And I don't know what to make of that, but this is, I think, part of the theme that's going on inside the Republican Party is in some ways, they are quite attuned to the internal heterogeneity of the Hispanic populations, right? So we obviously know that the Cubans, to some degree, Venezuelans, carry some of the anti-communist, anti-socialist politics of where they're coming from into our polity. But, regionally, Hispanics are very different. They come from different groups. The degree to which they're attached to that identity at all varies quite dramatically. And I think that creates a lot of play in the joints of what part of those groups can be carved out and appealed to in particular different ways, in a way that isn't really possible where African Americans are concerned. And so I think it is really important. We often talk about racial politics, while we don't really often talk about how African Americans and Hispanics really are constituted as groups in dramatically different ways.
And we have just a tiny bit of time for a response, Veshla.
Yeah, I mean, that's I'll just say, I think what you just said might have been true a decade or 15 years ago. I think it is no longer the case. I think that most of and empirically it's not the case, when you look at most of the pieces of legislation that have come out that are important to Latino voters. And again, I would look at Latino Decisions, some great polling by Matt Barreto there. Part of the reason why Latino voters came out en masse in places like Fort Myers, Florida in 2006, and in the hundreds of thousands to protest the Sensenbrenner bill, is that they felt criminalized as brown people. And there's been lots of good work on that by immigration scholars, by social movement scholars like Chris Cepeda-Millan. And so oddly, I think what you just said is wrong, because policy itself racialized and politicized the racial identity of a group. Okay.
Okay.
To be continued.
Yes, we're at time. Thank you for a rich discussion. Let me hand it back to Hari.
Thank you, everyone, for such a great discussion. I'm sorry that we had to cut it off in the middle, but I hope that only means that everyone will join us for the Q&A afterwards, where I hope Veshla and Steve can continue the discussion. We're going to pivot now to our next panel, which is a panel that's really looking to the future to explore the question, where do we go from here? But before we do that, we're going to have a short 2-minute break and have another musical performance by Willow Otten. Thank you so much, Willow, for that great music to help set the tone for our day today. Welcome back, everyone, to our second panel discussion, where do we go from here? As a reminder, my name is Hari Han, and I will be moderating the discussion, and I'm joined by two great people. First, we have Eric Edelman, who is the Roger Hertog Distinguished Professor, Practitioner in Residence at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at SAIS. It's a very long title. Which is well-deserved. He spent many years in the U.S. Foreign Service, serving as an ambassador during both the Clinton and Bush administrations, and has also held multiple senior positions in departments of state and defense, as well as in the White House. And we have with us Nathan Connolly, who is the Herbert Baxter Adams Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins. His work focuses on racism, capitalism, politics, cities, and migration in the late 19th and 20th centuries, paying special attention to people's notion of family, property, and citizenship in the United States and the wider Americas. The three of us are going to be talking about what the election means going forward and what steps we can take as a community and as a country to heal our divides and forge a future path together. As a reminder, we're not going to be taking questions during our panel discussion, but we welcome all of you to join us for the Q&A starting at 1 p.m. So let me start now with the discussion. So we just had such a fascinating discussion about what got us here and some of the many dimensions of the election. But let's pivot now to a discussion of where we go next. And I want to start with just thinking about the immediate 71 days that we have before us. We're in the very unusual situation of having an incumbent president who refuses to accept the outcome of the election, an outcome that many senior members of the party, but not everyone, have accepted. And so what challenges does this strange moment of flux kind of create for us? And so Nathan, maybe I'll start by inviting you to reflect on that question.
So I think there are clearly narratives that we had and held fast to as we were coming into the election. And so I think one of the ways to understand what we're now saying is in part to peg it to what we had been saying. Things like, understanding that there was supposed to be a blue wave of some kind, or there was going to be some kind of landslide. And we had, in some ways, talking points that were connected to what we believe to be the objective, like job performance of the president in terms of COVID deaths, in terms of America's standing in the international community, and so on. And so by virtue of what seemed like, basic faculties of reason, this should have been a much wider margin than it was. So the fact that the election outcome became so close then sparked a series of other narratives that have emerged now in the wake of the election. One of them being, for instance, to what degree did the Progressive Caucus actually make it harder for Biden to perform better in states where they imagined his candidacy would have had greater traction? To what extent, in fact, is it the inverse, in that you needed progressive organizers in general and Black women organizers in states like Georgia, particularly, to basically get Biden over the top? I think one could look, very clearly at the urban voter outcomes in states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio, and obviously by extension, like very dramatic kind of, denouement to the election in Pennsylvania, and imagine that African-American voters have a narrative that is going to certainly reflect what they believe to be, what we believe to be our indispensability to the, Democratic Party going forward. So that's another narrative. And there's going to be a lot of people who are watching what the first, 100 days of a Biden presidency looks like in light of that outcome. The other kind of piece of that in terms of the narrative, of course, are those folks, and we saw this in some of the early, tensions, even within the Democratic Party, between someone like, Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, or even commentary by folks like Joe Scarborough on MSNBC, where they look at the suburban voter as somehow being won over, and not running on platforms like defund the police is really the game plan of the Democratic Party going forward. And we need to really make sure that that is our takeaway. Now, I say all that to say that we're making all these accusations and narratives and assertions absent a whole lot of data. And so, a lot of this is really a reflection of what people's ideologies are and what their interests are as they're coming into this election, and in large part what they're going to try to protect as we come out of it.
That's great. And I want to get back to this question of the future of the political parties. But before we do that, Eric, I'd love for you to reflect on what you think about how this moment of interregnum might affect not only the United States domestically, but also U.S. interests abroad.
Well, thank you, Hari. It's great to be with you and Nathan, and I appreciate the opportunity. First, let me just say that I think it's very important in this moment to remember that whatever blue tsunami or blue wave people might have anticipated, or whatever hopes they had that there would be a fuller and more thorough repudiation of President Trump and Trumpism. And I'm one of the subjects of Steve Tellis's book on the Never Trumpers, so I speak with some authority on the question. I think it's important to remember that this election is not close. Right now, President-elect Biden is leading in the popular vote by more than 4 million votes. We still have lots of votes in New York State and California to be counted. I'm willing to bet money against any of the political scientists on this panel that he'll be close to a 7 million vote margin by the time all is said and done. He's likely to have as big or bigger a margin than President Obama had against Mitt Romney, on whose presidential campaign I worked. So this, and finally, and perhaps most important, the 306 electoral votes he's likely to receive at the end of the day is the same margin that President Trump claimed was a landslide in 2016. So this election is not close, and we ought not allow the president and his enablers to do any more damage than they're already doing by casting a doubt on the legitimacy of this election, because the only people who benefit from that ultimately are President Trump, but also our adversaries abroad, notably including Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, whose minions are, as we speak, working to undermine the legitimacy of American democracy by pointing out that our elections are just as fake as theirs. And that's I think, a terrible thing for the country. What worries me about the period ahead in this interregnum is that, you saw the president yesterday fire Secretary Esper. Today, there have been some more resignations in the Department of Defense.
Right.
Secretary Esper is reported to have told some of his associates that he is afraid that the president is about to fire Gina Haspel, the director of CIA, and perhaps Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI. And it's hard to understate how dangerous it is during a period of transition in national leadership, which takes a while in our country. We're not like the United Kingdom, where when you have an election, one prime minister steps aside, the other steps in and is handed a red box full of memos from the permanent cabinet undersecretary. Our transition takes time, and it takes time to assume control of all the federal agencies, to be briefed on all the intelligence. And it's a period when historically adversaries have thought to push the envelope and test whether the United States is really ready to defend all of its commitments abroad. And to decapitate the national security team in a period like this is the height of irresponsibility and extremely dangerous for the nation.
Yeah, so Eric, actually, I want to ask you to think more about that, because I feel like one of the big questions that Nathan alluded to also is this question of the future of each political party. You noted that you had been in Steve Tellis's book as a research subject, and we always try to put research subjects on with the authors on our on our events. That's a joke. But I'd love to have you kind of think more about what you think this election bodes, for the Republican Party or either party. I mean, it seems like the kind of debate that's going on within the party as all these events that you're describing unfold could be very prescient or not.
Well, Hari, my fear is that because of the results and because of, as Nathan said, the expectations that had been set ahead of time by the polling industry, which, by the way, needs to be burned down and built from the ground up, is that many Republicans are going to take the lesson that the problem was the messenger, but not necessarily the message. And that because of the incessant tweeting and the unpredictability and personal quirks of the president, he lost the election. But the message of cuddling up to white supremacists, to call into question the importance of our alliances abroad, free trade, et cetera, that those are winning messages for the Republican electorate. And you can already see any number of potential candidates lining themselves up to be part of that, Trump lane, if it were as it were in the Republican Party. And I'm sorry to say that there are precious few voices outside of that right now. I mean, I can think of Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney and maybe a couple of others, but very few are bucking this. Ben Sasse is another who's maybe a little bit outside that lane. And I think that's bad for the party and bad for the country. I mean, our system, I think, works best when we have a strong center-left party and a strong center-right party, and not parties dominated by the extremes. And right now, I think we have one party that is moving in a direction of being dominated by an extreme, and maybe to the point, ultimately, it will take a while longer than many of us thought, but I think ultimately it will go to the point of extinction.
Nathan, what are you seeing? What do you think?
Yeah, following upon the point about extinction. So this is absolutely going to be a moment that in ways that are deeply historical, try the structural integrity of our two-party system. And we might well see not just the splintering away from one party, but both parties in the time between now and the midterms of 22. And the reason I say that is for a couple of reasons. I think, Eric's point about what the Republican Party is going to have to do about its white supremacy problem is absolutely real. And one wonders whether there will be, a reassertion of the libertarian element within the GOP, if there will be an effort to reach out to entrepreneurs of color, if there's going to be, some kind of effort that tries by way of American foreign policy corners to try to stitch together a new and different coalition from the kind that clearly was, animating Trump's platform, again, before he even announced himself as a candidate. I mean, just to be very clear about who Trump was and what the runway was as he moved into national politics, it came from challenging very basic things like, Barack Obama's citizenship, even asking for his university transcripts. I mean, good old fashioned kind of anti-affirmative action style politics, laced with a little bit of Trump's own kind of secret sauce, right? So I think part of what the GOP is going to have to answer for sure is what it's going to do, in the wake of, again, a pretty decisive showing for a pretty tough and, divisive politic. And I want to just go back for a second. First, I want to say I'm not a political scientist. I'm a historian, and so my immediate parallel when I look at this moment is to think back to when voter turnout was also high and an election was deeply contested. We had about 161 million people cast votes. It was the highest turnout ever, but not the highest percentage ever in terms of voter turnout. And that distinction falls to the election of 1876 in the 19th century. Between Sam Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. And that election was, of course, so close that in order to secure the White House, the Republican Party agreed to pull the troops out of the South in order to end Reconstruction. And I raise it because this idea of compromise that came in the 19th century is now being visited to us again at this moment, being what kinds of gestures should the present day Democratic Party make to this flank of people who are deeply, fed up with what they imagine to be the Democratic Party, and what kinds of concessions and compromises will they issue? Will there be, for instance, someone like John Kasich placed in Biden's cabinet in order to show that he is bipartisan as a principle? What other parts of the progressive flank are going to be mortgaged away so that you can try to take these steps toward what the imagined Republican voter wants to do? We know the Lincoln Project was something that was built around this vision of a Biden Republican that frankly was not really borne out in the numbers in terms of the election returns. And so even though, I absolutely agree with Eric's point about thinking about the broad margin of voters, the 4 million plus and all of that, the narrative around this election will be that it was a close one. I think people are going to look at the House Democrats who lost their seats and use that as evidence for the reason why you have to again tack back toward the center. And I do think that it's not going to take too long before you see the Democratic Party also buckling under its own political contradictions, right? Will there be a place for there to be an overt anti-racism within the Democratic Party and districts that conservative Democrats are themselves trying to hold on to? Like, can this be a broad political argument that the entire party gets behind? And you have to believe that the kinds of people who are organizing on the ground in Atlanta, Philadelphia, Detroit, and elsewhere are going to be watching very closely a number of positions, not just in terms of housing and urban development, but also the Department of Treasury. Some of the sounds I'm hearing now are like, by looking at the Treasury Secretary appointment, you're going to get a very good sense about where the Biden White House really is on questions of economic populism, for example. So all that to say, I think that the first 100 days, again, or so of Biden's moment are going to be extraordinarily important for setting the tone of what the Democratic Party is going to be. I think that we can't ignore the fact that the progressive and the centrist elements of the modern Democratic Party are in agreement now in terms of getting Trump out. But whether or not it's going to be the kind of thing that you can, really run on at the local level and at the state level and beyond, that remains to be seen. The last thing I'll say about this is the Democratic Party is really going to have to investigate to what extent it's committed to, in some ways, bullying its progressive flank. And what I mean by that is just, you look at a organization like the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee within the House, and just in May of last year, they were very committed to basically denying any funding or support for anyone who would primary their incumbents, even in conservative districts, right? So they're trying to in some ways silence dissent within party ranks in order to prevent someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ayanna Pressley from rising to national office. And so I wonder to what extent, there's going to be a possible reshuffling, even within deeply internal Democratic mechanisms to allow for there to be much more robust debate, far from Republicanized within the Democratic Party, to then possibly move that party toward, again, keeping this coalition together. Because I fear, absent an overt progressive move, that may not hold for more than one election cycle.
So I want to follow up with what both of you are talking about, because Eric, you were sort of saying that you feel like the Republican Party could be moving towards extinction, and Nathan, you talked about the possibility of the Democrats kind of buckling under themselves. And so, like, can you guys reflect? I would love to have you reflect a little bit more on the, what do you think the future of the two-party system is? Like if we have both parties under threat of buckling? What does that look like? And one other kind of question that I'll put on the table as you reflect on that is, Nathan, you're sort of talking about this question of like, are the Democrats going to stick with their historic pattern of quote unquote bullying the progressive left? Whereas, Eric, I know in our conversation yesterday, you sort of made the point that historically, like part of what had happened in the 20th century is that the Democratic Party in the mid 20th century had stood up to the communist left. And that's part of what held the system together. And we're in a very different moment now. And so would love for you all to reflect a little bit on all those dynamics that you're seeing.
Well, first, let me just say that I agree with Nathan. I think both parties are actually in a profound crisis. I think we're entering a profound crisis of the American political system. And like Nathan, my training actually is as a historian. And actually, before I became a diplomatic historian, I studied the history of the American South with C. Vann Woodward, one of the great historians of the United States. And, I've had much occasion in the last couple of years to think back to the period in the late 1840s and 1850s when the party system came apart previously. And I think you see many of the same dynamics playing out, including the, increasingly violent tenor of people's rhetoric, which then transforms itself into interpersonal violence, and just the breakdown of comedy on the floor of the Congress. So that, of course, issued in a great civil war that the most costly war in our history that cost over 600,000 lives. So, I'm not predicting that we're going to have a civil war, but I do think the prospect for greater unrest and violence, we've seen some of that already happening, is real. We know from some terrific work by the political scientist Daniel Ziblatt that historically conservative parties played an important role in democracy arising in the West, particularly in the United Kingdom in the 19th century. And I think that preserving democracy is going to call upon conservatives to do something similar now. In the conversation we had yesterday, I was basically ruminating on the fact that all of us have grown up essentially in a period of time after World War II where the great threat to democracy was from the left in the form of the Soviet Union and the communist parties it sponsored around the world. And the great triumph of the United States and its allies in the Cold War was in no small part accomplished because of the success of liberal anti-communism, reading out of polite society and legitimate politics, totalitarian movements of the left. And I think today the threat to democracy, not just in the United States but globally, is from the populist authoritarian right. And I think conservatives now have to take upon themselves the mantle that liberal anti-communists did in the 1950s and into the 60s, and that is to rule out of bounds certain kinds of politics in our own home. And that's going to be painful and difficult because it means you lose a certain tranche of voters. But I think it'll be necessary for any kind of healthy conservative Republican Party to emerge out of all this.
So I both agree and disagree modestly with Eric's estimation. In the first, I think it's important to at least allow for the possibility that immediately after World War II, the greatest crisis that faced American democracy was Jim Crow and not necessarily communism, right? If you look at the mass disfranchisement of African Americans, you look at the kinds of racial violence, the first year after World War II, some 46 African Americans were murdered, by law enforcement through grassroots violence. The Birmingham Police Department in 1 year murders 5 Black GIs having just returned from serving their country abroad, right? I mean, it was a really pointed attack on Black communities. Obviously, the point of having the seniority system in the Senate that allowed Southerners to dominate foreign policy depended profoundly on Black disenfranchisement in their districts, right? So there's a lot that we can read in that mid-20th century period that is inflected by Cold War tones, but that depends profoundly on the lack of Black political participation and a lack that was violently imposed. But I think it actually dovetails quite nicely with Eric's broader point, which is to say, coming out of that crucible, of the Jim Crow period, what we had among the many, courageous stands and speeches and breakthroughs was something that we don't really see nowadays, which is the anti-racist Republican. And I want to just give a very, concrete example of this. Aside from the fact that, many Black people voted Republican through the 20th century, including for Nixon in 1960 and so forth, you had a character, like someone like Leon Panetta. So I know this is one of Eric's colleagues in the foreign relations community. Panetta, before he ever moved into the Department of Defense or the CIA, worked as an attorney in the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And in 1969 and 1970, he was extraordinarily committed, some would argue to a fault, to enforcing the desegregation guidelines laid out in the Civil Rights Act. And, the HEW at that point, which had appointees coming from Nixon, and Robert Finch was the head of it, they were really quite intent on putting the screws to Democratic politicians who were blocking in school districts across the South. They seized federal funds from over 130 school districts across the South that were not following desegregation mandates. Columbia University actually had $70 million in 1969 impounded by HEW for not hiring Black faculty, right? So that the kind of robust federal enforcement that you saw from Republican activists or attorneys or operatives within the administrative structure of the federal government was extraordinarily strong. And it was, in fact, obviously Nixon's effort to reach back to Jesse Helms, reach back to Strom Thurmond, reach back to those deep reservoirs of white racism that caused him in February of 1970 to fire Panetta. And this is a callback to the 19th century, because when Time magazine covered the firing of Panetta, they called it the end of Reconstruction. That's actually how they understood it, right? So having, and I really do believe, to Eric's point, that a lot of what's called for now, to be very frank, is a return to Reconstruction, a restarting of Reconstruction that would include very populist approaches on questions of economic justice, rebuilding impoverished communities, but also being quite overt in saying that we have anti-racism and an honoring of subaltern people as a very clear and full-throated American value, and not really engage in the dog whistle politics that have dominated the GOP for the last half century, right? There's a real opportunity here to do that. The last thing I'll say about this, and because you asked the question before about what does it look like going forward, I think part of this is actually paying attention to the suburban nature of the way that the political system kind of gears itself and thinks about suburban entitlements and suburban privileges and so forth. However, since about 2005, the majority of poor people in this country live in suburbs, right? So even the suburbs is a place now that needs a very real updating in the political imagination of party operatives and so forth. What would it mean to have a kind of suburban outreach that acknowledged the challenges facing school districts, the challenges facing folks trying to get, good, food and, other kinds of resources, and what actually happened in American cities that made it in developers' interests and local politicians' interests to try to scatter poverty to the fringes where it now currently resides. I think a lot of what the future of American politics will include is whether or not, Democrats, Republicans, or whatever third parties might emerge can really make inroads into these places of suburban poverty that will often feel disconnected from, again, robust political participation and really, representation in terms of how politics currently tends to get organized.
Hari, there may be less disagreement between Nathan and me than he suggested, because I would just point out that I don't disagree with his characterization that the greatest threat to democracy at home at the end of World War II was Jim Crow. And moreover, the people I had in mind, the liberal anti-communists, were the very people like then Mayor, later Senator Hubert Humphrey, who in 1948 led the effort to put a civil rights plank into the Democratic platform in 1948 that led to the walkout of the Dixiecrats from the Democratic Party. So it's really the very same people who were, doing both the work of liberal anti-communism and civil rights in the Democratic Party. And to my colleague Leon Panetta, to that point, I would just point out that he began his career in politics as a legislative aide to Senator Thomas Kuchel, a liberal Republican senator from the state of California. That was in a period of time when California was actually a two-party state. And some of the Republicans in the state of California were actually liberals.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we are unfortunately at the end of our time. I actually have so many other things that I'd love to follow up with both of you, but I hope that our whole audience will join us to continue this discussion with Nathan and Eric, but also all the members of our first panel in the Q&A. And so I think that what you need to do is the registration confirmation email that you got should have the link to join the Zoom that is dedicated to that Q&A. I mean, if you haven't registered, then it's not too late to do it now. Just click on the link that's below your screen to register, and you'll receive an immediate confirmation email and can join us in the Zoom right now. So I also want to thank, before we close, Willow Otten, who is going to give us one final presentation to close our webcast. And so Willow, thank you so much for participating and having your beautiful music be a part of today's event. And we will see all of you in the Zoom for the Q&A.